She wasn't looking for anyone. He was supposed to be dead. One stormy night in Maine, Dr. Claire Benton, once a top trauma surgeon, now a ghost of herself, finds a wounded man on the edge of the frozen shore. No name, no explanation, just blood, silence, and a gun tucked in his coat. But when federal agents show up with orders to shoot on sight, Claire makes a choice she can't undo. She lies. Not for him, but for something inside her that still believes in second chances. What begins as a rescue becomes a dangerous bond between two broken people, one running from justice, the other from her past. And when the snow clears, nothing will ever be the same. Before we begin, ask yourself, would you save a stranger if it meant risking everything? Claire saw him because she wasn't looking. Her eyes were blurred from not sleeping, from staring too long at nothing through her cabin window, a faded rectangle of glass halfway crusted over by frost. It was supposed to be another day of silence, of bitter tea and guilt steeped in regret. But something flickered at the edge of her vision, a shape, not moving. Her breath caught, and she blinked hard once, twice. There, in the shifting white where beach met ocean's edge, a dark smear lay slumped against the snow. She was on her feet before her brain caught up. The cold stabbed through her boots, biting at her legs as she trudged down the frozen slope toward the water. Her body, still sore from nights of sleeping on the floor instead of the bed she no longer felt she deserved, moved with an urgency she hadn't felt in months. As she got closer, her breath stilled. It was a man, barefoot, bloodied, skin graying with frostbite. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands already moving. Pulse, pupils, breath. Faint, but there. Her stomach knotted. His eyes fluttered open for a second, then closed. That was all she needed. She didn't know how she got him up the hill, only that by the time they reached the door of her cabin, she was soaked in melting snow and his blood. Her arms ached. Her heart did worse. He was heavy, not just in weight, but in the way trauma makes a body sink. Her hands fumbled at the latch, shoulders straining as she dragged him over the threshold. She collapsed beside him for a breathless moment on the hardwood floor, her own chest heaving in shock. Then training took over. Claire stood, moved the kitchen table with a grunt, ripped the covers off the bed to make a place to work. He was still unconscious. His hands were raw, fingers blackened at the tips, gunshot wounds. At least two that she could see through the shredded remnants of his shirt, a deep gash across the ribs, rope burns on the wrists, torture. No other word fit. Her mind catalogued the injuries mechanically, but her hands shook as she cut his clothes away, sterilized her tools, boiled water on the stove. "Don't die," she muttered aloud, pressing gauze to a seeping wound. "Not after I dragged you in here. Not today." He moaned once as she stitched the first bullet wound. She paused, his head turned slightly as if to look at her, but the eyes didn't open. "You're going to make it," she whispered more to herself than to him, clenching her jaw. The skin around the wound was swollen and hot. Infection was already setting in. She worked faster, cursing her limited supplies. Antibiotics, yes. IV fluids, barely enough. Oxygen, none. Claire had spent 3 months running from the world, convinced she wasn't fit to keep anyone alive ever again. Now she had a stranger bleeding out on her kitchen floor, and not a second to waste. She cleaned and stitched, cauterized where necessary, started the IV, and kept talking softly to him as if it would anchor her. "I don't know who you are," she muttered, "but I swear to God, if you survive this, you better be someone worth saving." He made no answer, but his chest rose, shallow and slow. She forced her hand to steady as she stitched the second wound. Night fell without her noticing. The storm hadn't let up. Ice clung to the windows, the kind that looked like veins cracking through glass. Inside, the air reeked of blood, antiseptic and melting snow. She sat beside him now, her knees drawn to her chest, a threadbare blanket over her shoulders. He hadn't woken. His breathing was steadier, but the fever was high. She pressed a damp cloth to his forehead again, then looked down at his face. He didn't look like a good man. Something about the way his jaw stayed tight, even in unconsciousness. The bruises on his ribs weren't just fresh, they were intentional. He'd been beaten with rhythm. Someone had wanted him broken. And yet, he'd survived long enough to wash up on her shore. Claire hated that she respected that. Her hands were still stained crimson. It had been months since she touched a patient. Not since the night she lost control in that OR in Boston. Not since they told her to take a leave before someone sued. And yet, here she was, kneeling on splintered floorboards beside a man who could be anything. A victim, a criminal, a ghost. And she had made a choice to keep him alive. Hours passed. Claire hardly moved. Once she rose to feed the fire, but never far enough to leave him unattended. She checked his pulse again, reflexively, still there. When she sat back down, she noticed something beneath the shredded collar of his shirt. A chain. A dog tag? No. She gently pulled it free. It wasn't military. It was a small silver locket, warm with his body heat. She didn't open it. That felt wrong even now. Instead, she tucked it back under the blanket and whispered, "Tomorrow, you'll tell me who you are." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. But a hollow one. She didn't know if he'd wake up again, didn't know if she'd be ready to hear his truth when it came. Still, her voice had steadied. She hadn't realized how much she missed that, sounding like someone in control, even when she wasn't. Her hands were cold, her mind raw, but something inside her had shifted. Not healed, not yet, but shifted. She stared at him. And for the first time in months, Claire Benton didn't feel like the most broken person in the room. The storm was still there. It hadn't lessened, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the man on her floor. What mattered was that she had pulled him out of the snow, that he was breathing, that he hadn't died. Not yet. She sat back, exhausted, her spine pressed to the wall, eyes refusing to close. This wasn't a story she had asked for. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't purpose. It was something else entirely, something nameless that still had blood on its hands and snow in its hair. Claire closed her eyes for just a moment and exhaled. A long, fractured breath that carried no answers, only weight. The man remained still, barely moving, and yet somehow his presence filled every shadow of the room. This was the beginning. She didn't know why. She didn't know how. But in that silent, bitter hour, Claire Benton knew one thing without doubt. This man would not die in the snow. Not today. Not while she was breathing. Claire lost track of how many times she changed the damp cloth on his forehead. The fever didn't break, only flared and faded in unpredictable waves. His breathing rasped, shallow but stubborn, like a man refusing to surrender. She moved between the kitchen counter and the makeshift operating space she had created on the floor, not because she needed to, but because standing still felt unbearable. She crushed antibiotics into lukewarm water, eased a spoon between his lips, coaxing a swallow from a throat that could barely manage it. "Come on," she murmured softly. "I've seen worse. I've pulled people back from the edge. You're not going to be the one I lose in this cabin." Her voice sounded firmer than she felt, but she kept going. The fevered mutterings that escaped him were disjointed, names, fragments, numbers. Claire caught none of them, only the tremor in his hands when she wiped his mouth. When she touched his wrist to check the pulse, she realized her thumb was still there, even after she counted. She was holding on without meaning to. By the second day, she had begun to notice the inconsistencies, the ruined clothes that didn't belong to any fisherman or hiker she had ever seen on that coast. The small, deliberate ink mark curling up his forearm beneath the bandages, a stylized wolf's head. Not amateur work, but something commissioned. She'd seen similar emblems in news reports, the kind attached to organized crime stories. When she moved his shredded jacket to wash the blood out, she felt something hard sewn into the lining. Curious, she worked the stitches loose with a scalpel and found a compact pistol, small enough to conceal in a boot, and 2 extra magazines sealed in plastic. She didn't touch the weapon beyond wrapping it in a towel and tucking it out of sight on the top shelf of the pantry. "Who the hell are you?" she whispered under her breath. He didn't answer. His eyes fluttered but didn't open. She found herself glaring at him as if he'd done it on purpose. That night he woke briefly, not fully awake, just enough to look at her. His gaze was hazy but focused in a way that unsettled her. "Where am I?" he rasped, his voice cracked and low. "Safe," she said quickly, trying to sound neutral. "You're in my cabin, Maine coast. You were dying." "I fixed what I could." He licked his lips, grimaced as if the name of the place hurt. "You shouldn't have..." The rest trailed off. "Shouldn't have what?" she asked. He closed his eyes again, jaw clenched. "Doesn't matter," he muttered. She wanted to shake him, to demand answers, but instead she sat back on her heels. "It matters to me," she said quietly. "It matters because you're here, and I deserve to know why." But he was already gone again, sinking back into fever sleep, leaving her alone with the echo of his half-words. The next morning she tried again. This time she set a bowl of broth on the table and pulled up a chair close enough that her knees brushed the blanket covering him. "Lucas," she tested, though he hadn't given her a name yet. His eyes opened slowly, still glassy, but more aware. "Not Lucas," he whispered, then shut his mouth tight like a child caught in a lie. "Then tell me what it is," she pressed gently. "Tell me something." His eyes flicked to her hands instead of her face. "Why are you helping me?" The question startled her. "Because you're hurt," she answered automatically. "Because that's what I do." "Not anymore," he said hoarsely, and she realized he knew something about her leave of absence. He shouldn't have known that. "You're not supposed to know that," she said. "You talk in your sleep," he murmured, and a faint, almost smile ghosted across his mouth. The conversation, if it could be called that, fell apart soon after. He refused water, turned his face to the wall. She sat there a long time, watching his back rise and fall, her mind racing. Every part of her training screamed at her to call someone, anyone, but the idea of opening the door to strangers while he lay there felt like betrayal. And still, she couldn't deny the truth clawing at her. This was no lost hiker. This was someone who had been hunted, someone who had fought back. The weapon, the tattoo, the cryptic muttering, the reflexive way he'd scanned the room even in pain. It all spoke of a life steeped in violence. Claire didn't want any part of that. Yet she stayed. Her hands hovered near his shoulder but didn't touch. She whispered instead, "You're going to tell me who you are, and I'll decide what to do." But the only answer was his steady, unnatural silence. As the day blurred into night, Claire realized she wasn't just treating wounds anymore. She was circling a gravity well, being pulled toward a story she hadn't chosen. While she cleaned the stitches, while she checked his IV, she felt old memories resurface. The OR lights, the beeping monitors, the moment when she froze and a patient slipped away. She had built this cabin to bury it all. Now, with every breath the man took, those memories clawed back up. She studied his face again, the lines carved deep around his eyes, and something in her chest shifted painfully. He was still a stranger, still dangerous, but somehow, in his silence, he had started to unearth pieces of her she thought were gone. As she sat back and wiped her hands on a towel, Claire understood that she was no longer the only one in this room fighting ghosts. It came without warning, just after midnight. Claire had been reading a dog-eared medical journal by flashlight, her ears tuned to every shift in his breath, every flutter of his eyelids. His fever had dropped slightly, enough that his voice had started surfacing in incoherent fragments. She'd heard more groans and muttered curses than real speech, but this time was different. His eyes opened and didn't drift shut again. They focused on her, not sharply, but deliberately. A silence stretched between them, taut as wire. Then he said it. Just one word. "Lucas." She blinked, unsure she heard right. "Lucas what?" she asked softly, moving closer. No answer came. His lips parted, then pressed together again like he'd said too much. "Is that your first name?" "Last?" She tried again. Still nothing. Just a hollow look that said, "That's all you get." She wanted to ask more, wanted a reason, a story, even a lie, but he closed his eyes and turned his face to the wall. Claire stared at him, heart pounding with the quiet weight of it. Lucas. It didn't give her much, but somehow, hearing him name himself made him real. And real people could be saved or ruined. She barely had time to sit with the impact of that name before the knock came. Not a polite tap, a heavy, practiced pounding that rattled the hinges. Claire stood instantly, her heart jackknifing. She looked at the man on the floor. Lucas, if he was telling the truth. Then at the door. Her instinct screamed. Whoever was out there hadn't wandered in by accident. She moved silently to the window, peering through a slit in the curtain. Two men in heavy coats, both armed, not uniformed. One held a badge in his gloved hand, pressed flat against the glass, just long enough for her to read 3 large letters, FBI. Claire stepped back. "Lucas," she whispered urgently. His eyes opened again. He'd heard the knock. "Don't move," she told him. "Stay quiet." His jaw tensed. He didn't ask questions. That worried her more than if he had. She crossed to the door, forced her hands to be steady, and opened it a crack. The cold hit her first, then the flash of metal on belts, the sharp gaze of men who were trained not to blink. "Ma'am," the lead agent said, voice clipped, "we're looking for someone. May have come through this way." He didn't hand her a photo, didn't ask permission to enter. That told her they weren't here to investigate. They were here to eliminate. She straightened. "I haven't seen anyone," she said, and the lie tasted metallic on her tongue. The agent stared at her a beat too long. "White male, late 30s, wounded, maybe armed, dangerous." "This is private property," she said firmly, nodding behind her. "Just me out here, and a whole lot of snow." The second agent shifted. He didn't believe her. Maybe neither did the first. "Mind if we come in?" The lead one asked, and it wasn't a question. "I do, actually. I have patients' records in here. HIPAA still applies, even in a snowstorm." It wasn't true, but it sounded official. The agent stared at her another second, then finally nodded. "We'll check back. If you see anything, call this number. Don't approach him. Orders are shoot on sight." Claire took the card with numb fingers. She watched them turn and walk back toward their vehicle, hearts thudding like war drums in her chest. When the door shut behind her, she didn't move, didn't breathe, not until the sound of tires crunching over packed ice faded into silence. Then she turned to look at Lucas. His face was pale, his jaw clenched so tightly she thought he might crack a molar. "They're looking for you," she said. "And they're not here to arrest you." He didn't deny it, didn't speak, just looked at her with an expression so raw and resigned, it almost made her knees buckle. "You could have warned me," she snapped, not because she was angry, because fear was boiling in her throat. "You let me stand there and lie for you without knowing a damn thing." He opened his mouth, winced, and said nothing. She hated how weak he looked, hated more how that made her want to protect him. "They said you're armed," she added. "They didn't say you were injured, or hunted, or whatever this is." Still no answer, only silence and eyes that wouldn't let hers go. She sat down hard on the stool near the table. Her hands trembled now. She rubbed them against her jeans like it would wipe off the lie she'd just told. It hadn't been reflex. It had been a choice. She had looked at federal agents, armed and trained, and told them no. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was his eyes, the way he hadn't begged. Maybe it was the understanding that whoever Lucas was, he had run out of people who'd buy him even one more minute. She thought of herself, months ago, back in the OR, hands shaking over a body she couldn't save. No one had given her time that night. No one had stepped between her and the fallout. Maybe part of her had just wanted to give someone what she never got. A pause, a chance. "I don't know why I did that," she muttered. Lucas blinked slowly. "You didn't have to. That's the problem," she murmured. And in that space between them, something fragile had been created. Not trust, not yet, but the first filament of something older than that. Need. The flash drive had been stitched into the lining of his duffel bag, hidden behind a layer of black fabric meant to resist wear, fire, maybe even detection. Claire found it by accident while cleaning blood from his belongings, when her fingers brushed an odd seam that didn't belong. She didn't intend to snoop, she told herself that, but by the time she stood in front of her old laptop, an offline relic with outdated software and a cracked screen, her hands were already moving, slipping the drive into the port with the care of someone disarming a bomb. The files loaded slowly. Hundreds of folders, most named with numbers and letters she didn't understand, but one was labeled Voss Internal. She clicked, and then the name appeared in bold on a scanned passport. Lucas R. Voss. Cartel documentation, logistics charts, wire transfers in numbers that made her stomach churn. Surveillance images of men tied to chairs, confidential memos in Spanish, marked with government seals, not just a member, a leader, a creator of something vast, violent, and very real. Claire's breath locked in her chest. She pushed the laptop away like it had burned her, but the images remained, etched behind her eyes like an after-image of lightning. Lucas was asleep when she returned to the room, or pretending to be. She watched his face in the dim light and wondered how many lives had looked into those eyes before disappearing into the shadows he commanded. A man like him didn't rise in an empire like that without drowning in blood. But now his face was drawn, pale, vulnerable. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, and whatever had been carved into his body, by bullets, betrayal, or both, had also etched something deeper into his spirit. She sat down across from him, holding the flash drive in her hand like a talisman. "Lucas," she said. His eyes opened immediately. He didn't pretend to be confused. He didn't ask what was wrong. He looked at her, saw the answer in her posture, in the tight set of her mouth. He let out a slow, tired breath. "I thought you might find it," he murmured. "I didn't mean to." "But you did." "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Because you already didn't trust me. I didn't want to make it worse." She flinched at that. "Then why come here? Why let me save you?" His answer took a long time. "Because I didn't think I'd live long enough for it to matter." She stood and paced, shaking her head. "You lied." "I didn't lie," he replied calmly. "I just didn't volunteer the truth." "Don't split hairs, Lucas. You let me believe you were some wronged man on the run." "I am," he said. "Just not the way you imagined." Claire threw the flash drive onto the table. "You're a cartel boss. People die because of you." He didn't deny it. He didn't look away. "I built something I thought I could control. I was wrong. The people I brought in, the deals I made, they corrupted faster than I did. When I tried to dismantle it, they turned on me." His voice cracked. "I wasn't running because I got caught. I was running because I tried to destroy them, and they beat me to the punch." Claire stared at him, arms crossed so tightly her nails dug into her skin. "So, what now? You think you get to hide out in my house, heal up, and then go back to being some martyr kingpin?" "No," he said, his voice low. "I came here to die, but you didn't let me." That silenced her. The room seemed too full of words that no longer mattered. "I should make you leave," she said finally, though it came out quieter than she meant. "I know," he replied with no defensiveness. I wouldn't stop you if you did." But he made no move to get up, and she made no move to help him do so. The space between them was thick with the things they couldn't unsay. Claire walked to the door and opened it. Cold air rushed in, the kind that cut through bone. Lucas flinched, not from the wind, but from the memory it stirred, the same memory she had when she first dragged him in. He had almost died on that shore. She had kept him alive, and now, after everything, he was still here. She stared out at the darkness, considering the choice before her. She didn't owe him kindness. She didn't owe him anything at all. But the truth, brutal and unwelcome, was that she no longer saw the man on the flash drive when she looked at him. She saw the man in her bed, pale and quiet, bearing wounds he hadn't tried to hide. She saw a man who had once believed he deserved no rescue. And that was something she understood far too well. With one motion, Claire closed the door, not slamming it, not rushing, just a firm, conscious decision to shut out the world on the other side. Lucas watched her silently as she walked back toward him. She didn't say anything, neither did he. Whatever had been exposed between them didn't need explanation. They were two people caught in a collapsing middle, neither innocent nor evil, just wreckage from different storms, trying to find someplace still standing. The cabin felt smaller now, not in a suffocating way, but in the way a lifeboat feels small in open water, crowded with consequence. She sat back down, hands clasped in her lap, breathing slower now. He lay back on the pillow, eyes closing again, not from trust, but exhaustion. Claire didn't forgive him. Not yet, maybe not ever, but she hadn't thrown him out. And in that single, wordless choice, the fragile world they shared shrank a little more, tighter, darker, more dangerous. But theirs. The shot cut through the night like a warning, sharp and unmistakable. Claire barely had time to register it before Lucas shoved her to the floor. "Get down!" he hissed, grabbing for the pistol she'd hidden under a pile of books. Another shot followed, closer this time. The window above them shattered, sending shards into the living room rug. She felt her heart lurch to the rhythm of panic, her mind scrambling to catch up. Lucas pressed a hand to his arm, and when he pulled it back, it was red. "You're hit," she breathed. "I've had worse," he said, gritting his teeth. "We have to move." There was no time to argue. She grabbed a flashlight, yanked the trapdoor near the fireplace, and together they stumbled down into the cold darkness of the cellar below. Dust and old wine bottles greeted them like ghosts. Claire helped him into a corner, his blood leaving a trail across the stone floor. Her hands worked automatically, but her brain reeled. This wasn't what she'd signed up for. She had taken an oath to heal, not to harbor fugitives in shootouts. Yet here she was, patching up a drug lord in her wine cellar like it was the most natural thing in the world. He winced as she pressed gauze into the wound, but didn't complain. "You shouldn't be doing this," he said through clenched teeth. Claire ignored him, ripping open a sterile pack from the emergency kit she kept in the cellar for storms and long blackouts. "Too late," she muttered. Blood seeped through the fabric, warm and insistent. "I need you to hold still." Lucas obeyed, jaw tight, every muscle in his body vibrating with restraint. "They were aiming for you too," he said after a moment. "That shot wasn't just for me." She paused, met his gaze. "I know." "Then why the hell didn't you throw me out when you had the chance?" Claire didn't answer right away. She stitched in silence, each pull of the thread binding them tighter together. She had no words for the choice she made the night she closed the door. It hadn't been logic. It hadn't even been pity. It was something else. Something primal and unfinished, like a sentence she hadn't figured out how to end. "You're not just in this anymore," he said, watching her. "You're part of it." Claire nodded slightly, but kept her eyes on the sutures. "I realized that the moment I opened my mouth to lie for you." Lucas leaned back against the wall, his face pale, his breathing shallow but steady. "That lie could get you killed," he said. "That's not your burden." She looked up at him then. "It became mine the second someone pulled a trigger in my direction." There was no melodrama in her tone, just a quiet certainty, the kind that doesn't demand agreement. "You don't owe me anything for this, Lucas," she added. "This isn't about debt." He looked away, fingers flexing once before curling into his lap. "Then what is it about?" She didn't answer immediately. She didn't know how to say that her whole life had narrowed to this moment, to these wounds, this room, this man she couldn't explain even to herself. She taped the last of the bandages into place and leaned back. Her hands were smeared with blood, and the silence between them throbbed with everything left unsaid. Claire remembered a time, not long ago, when her days were sterile. Surgical rooms, fluorescent lights, predictable pain. Now her world was dirt, danger, and choices that couldn't be undone, and yet for the first time in months, she didn't feel numb. Lucas reached for her hand as she started to rise. It wasn't a desperate grab, but a slow, intentional gesture. His fingers wrapped around hers, calloused and strong despite the tremble beneath them. "You don't know what you're doing," he said softly. The way he said it, it wasn't a warning. It was almost a plea. She could have pulled away. She didn't. Their hands stayed locked longer than they should have, bound not by affection, but by something murkier, recognition. Claire finally pulled her hand free, more gently than she intended. She stood, wiped her palms on her jeans, and turned away. But her shoulders were shaking, not from fear, but from something deeper. Lucas leaned back, eyes fluttering shut again, his breath slowing with every minute. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was dense, saturated with choices made in a split second that would echo for a lifetime. She looked at him one more time and felt a strange ache rise in her chest. Not for what he was, but for what he wasn't allowed to be anymore. She had been walking through her own hell for so long, she hadn't noticed the smoke until she saw it in someone else's eyes. This wasn't about guilt. It wasn't about redemption. Not yet. It was about the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, broken things could still find something worth saving in each other. And so, in the dark cellar that smelled of rust and salt and blood, Claire understood something she hadn't been ready to admit until now. She had crossed a line. Not for Lucas. Not to play hero. But because for the first time in far too long, she too wanted to be saved. The snow had stopped sometime before dawn. It was the kind of silence that didn't just fall over a place. It pressed into it, filled the cracks, softened the sharp edges left behind by the storm. Claire stood by the window, watching the white landscape settle into stillness. It was strange how peace could look like surrender. Behind her, Lucas was awake, already gathering the shards of broken glass from the floor. He hadn't asked for help, hadn't made a sound. Just quietly worked to put back what had been shattered, even if the effort was mostly symbolic. She joined him without a word. Between them, a rhythm formed, not of conversation, but of motion. When the last of the jagged panes had been cleared, they covered the open space with a sheet of thick plastic she found in the shed. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold. As they taped it into place, Lucas winced once, his arms still weak from the gunshot. Claire reached out on instinct, steadied him, and he nodded in thanks. No performance, no masks, just survival, side by side. Later, Lucas disappeared into the small kitchen for a long time. Claire heard the clatter of metal, the click of the stove, and the occasional curse under his breath. When he returned, he held two mismatched mugs of chamomile tea, hands trembling slightly, either from pain or something else entirely. "I don't cook," he said dryly, "but I can boil water." She took the mug, surprised by how warm it felt between her fingers. They sat in silence, sipping slowly. He didn't try to fill the quiet, and she didn't feel the need to either. Eventually he got up again, rummaging through drawers until he found a pen. She watched him tear a corner off an old envelope, then pause for a long time before writing something. He left the slip of paper folded neatly on the table, as if it were both a message and an offering. Claire waited until he stepped out of the room before unfolding it. Just her name. Claire. Nothing more. No explanation, no apology, no threat. And yet, it meant something. She didn't know why she tucked it into her pocket, only that she did. That night, for the first time since his arrival, they didn't sleep in separate rooms. There was no discussion about it, no awkward suggestion, just an unspoken agreement that neither of them wanted the distance anymore. They made makeshift beds in the main room, far enough apart to breathe, close enough to feel the presence of another human being. Claire couldn't remember the last time she had fallen asleep in the same space as someone else. It wasn't comfort she was after. Not really. It was presence. Lucas didn't speak. He just lay there, staring at the ceiling, his breath slow and steady. She mirrored it, matching the rhythm without thinking. And for a while, they simply existed. Two broken things, learning how to stop bracing for the next disaster. Claire's tears came later, not loud or messy, just quiet and insistent, slipping from the corners of her eyes before she even realized she'd started crying. She turned her face into the pillow, not to hide it, but because she didn't know what to do with it. She wasn't mourning something specific. It wasn't about Lucas. It wasn't even about the danger they were still in. It was grief without a name for something long buried and never really laid to rest. She felt the mattress shift as he turned his head. Didn't look at him. Didn't need to. "You lost someone," he said. His voice wasn't heavy, but it carried weight. She nodded into the silence, not trusting herself to speak. "I did too," he added after a moment, and that was all. No questions, no backstories, just two sentences that somehow said everything that needed to be said. Claire didn't thank him, he didn't offer comfort, but something moved between them, something fragile and real, like a bridge built from ash. They lay in the dark like that, not touching, not speaking, just breathing in the same rhythm, sharing the same invisible wound. And in that space, between grief and breath, between silence and understanding, there was something close to peace. Not the peace of safety, not yet, but the kind that comes from being seen, even if only in the dim light of a broken world. A world where the snow had finally stopped. They came at dawn, without warning, without mercy. Claire had just opened her eyes when the first window exploded inward. No words. No negotiations, just bullets slicing through silence and fire, lighting the sky like a second sunrise. The cartel didn't send messengers this time. They sent hunters. 5 men, maybe more, armed and dressed for war. Claire barely had time to grab the bag of supplies she'd stashed under the floorboards before Lucas pulled her toward the back door. They didn't speak, didn't look at each other, just moved. Instinct had taken over. One of the men blocked the rear exit, but Lucas didn't hesitate. A struggle, a knife, a broken arm. The man collapsed and they ran. The old trail behind the property, hidden beneath layers of snow and memory, became their only hope. The cabin was burning by the time they disappeared into the trees. Claire didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could hear the collapse, feel the heat chasing them through the cold. That house, those quiet nights, everything they hadn't said, it was all turning to ash. Lucas stumbled, clutching his side, and Claire saw the blood. "How bad?" she asked. He didn't answer. He just kept walking. Their escape was a blur of frostbitten branches and uneven steps. Lucas grew heavier with each mile, his weight sagging against her like a man already half dead. Claire refused to let him fall. The trail was old, forgotten even by locals, but she knew where it ended, an abandoned lighthouse on the edge of the cliffside, a place she'd discovered years ago during one of her self-imposed exile hikes. The kind of place no one went anymore. They reached it just as Lucas collapsed onto the stone steps. His face was gray, the wound in his abdomen soaking through every layer of clothing. Claire didn't hesitate. She pulled him inside, locked the door behind them, and turned the dusty interior into an operating room. There were no tools. No anesthesia, just rusted surgical scissors from her emergency pack, a bottle of whiskey, and the small lantern light that flickered against the cold stone walls. Lucas didn't scream when she cut into him. He just bit down on a rolled cloth and watched her eyes, trusting her with something more than his life, trusting her with what was left of him. Her hands shook, not from fear but from fury, at the men who did this, at the choices that brought them here, at a world where love and war lived in the same breath. Claire worked in silence, her focus absolute. She'd done field surgery before, in war zones and ER trauma rooms, but this was different. This was intimate, raw. Every time he winced, she swallowed a sob. Every time his blood hit her wrist, she fought the instinct to fall apart. She sutured the worst of it, flushed the wound with alcohol, packed it as best she could. Then she sat back, exhausted, trembling, and stared at the man who should have died a dozen times over. Lucas lay still, barely breathing, his skin damp and cold. For a long time, she said nothing. Just watched the rise and fall of his chest, each breath a small miracle. When his eyes finally fluttered open, there was no fear in them. Just fatigue, recognition, and something softer, something that looked dangerously close to grief. Claire leaned forward and wrapped her fingers around his, not tight, not demanding, just there, present, steady. He didn't pull away. She felt his thumb twitch once against her palm, then go still. "It's over," she whispered. The words caught in her throat, but she forced them out. Not because she believed them, she wasn't sure she did, but because he needed to hear them. "They're gone. You're safe. For now." Lucas looked past her, eyes unfocused, his lips parted but no sound came. "I'm here," she added quietly, unsure if she was promising something she couldn't keep. But it felt necessary. She was too far in to pretend detachment anymore. What had begun as survival had turned into something else, something that had no name and no rules. She couldn't undo the past. She couldn't erase what he'd done or what he was. But she could be this moment, this anchor. And yet, even as the weight of survival eased from her shoulders, Claire saw it in his face. Peace hadn't come with the escape. Lucas was still somewhere between worlds, trapped in the limbo of what he had been and what he might become. He blinked, looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not the cartel leader, not the fugitive, but a man emptied out by his own story. "It's not over," he finally murmured, his voice like gravel. "Not for me." Claire nodded. She didn't argue, because she knew the blood had dried. The fire had faded, but one last choice still lingered, one he would have to make alone, and until then she would sit beside him, holding what pieces remained. When he closed his eyes again, Claire didn't move. She stayed with his hand in hers, the silence between them thicker than before. Because now it wasn't just about survival, it was about what came next. And in that lighthouse, surrounded by the weight of what they'd lost and the flicker of what might still be saved, she knew the ending wasn't written yet. Not for him, not for her, not for either of them. Lucas left during the night without a sound, just as quietly as he had entered her life. Claire woke to the absence more than the silence. The space beside the mattress cold, the room too still. On the rickety wooden table sat two things, a folded note and a flash drive. Her name was scrawled across the envelope in his familiar, blunt handwriting. She stared at it for a long time before touching it, unsure if opening it would make it feel more real or more final. She read the note once, then again, lips trembling around nothing but air. "Claire, you saved more than my life. I'm giving you back yours. I'm giving them everything. Don't try to find me. Just live." The pen drive, heavy in her palm, held the weight of justice. It contained documents, audio files, transaction logs, names, so many names. Enough to dismantle the empire he once ruled, and in doing so, enough to bury himself under it. He had asked for only one thing in return when he walked into FBI custody later that night: full immunity for Claire Benton. His condition was non-negotiable. She was not to be touched. Ever. The news didn't break for several weeks. When it did, Claire was already gone from the lighthouse, already back in Boston. Headlines called him everything from the Judas Kingpin to the cartel turncoat. But the deal held. Claire watched the press conferences from the sidelines, stone-faced, unreadable, as men she didn't know in suits and wires discussed Lucas like a chess piece. She never spoke to anyone about what happened in Maine. Not to her colleagues, not to the FBI, not even to her therapist. The note stayed with her, always, folded and tucked in the inner lining of her white coat. She returned to the hospital quieter, sharper. Her scalpel was steadier, her eyes harder to meet. Some said she'd healed. Others said she'd just closed up the wound better. But Claire knew the truth. She was someone else now. Not a ghost anymore, not a savior either, just someone who'd stood still while the world burned around her and somehow walked out alive. That counted for something. That had to count for something. Every now and then, between surgeries or late at night on the edge of sleep, she would touch the paper in her coat pocket. Just the edges. Just to make sure it was still there. She never reread it after that first week. She didn't need to. The words were burned into her. There was no romance in them, no empty promises, just a truth as brutal and clear as the night he left. He hadn't gone to die. He'd gone to finish something, to leave a door open. For her. For them, maybe. But mostly for himself. A man can live with blood on his hands. He can even die with it. But Lucas Voss had chosen to cleanse it not with words or forgiveness, but by detonating the world that made him. Claire knew that wasn't redemption. It wasn't even grace. It was a reckoning. And it had come at a cost only he could pay. 6 months passed. The seasons turned, but she barely noticed. Patients came and went. Bones mended. Hearts stopped. She worked. She slept. She existed. On some days, that was enough. On others, she would find herself driving for hours after a shift. No destination in mind, only movement. And she drove all the way back to the edge of Maine. Not the cabin, it was long gone, but the beach below it, still frozen, still biting. She stood there as the wind cut across her cheeks, holding her coat tighter, not for warmth, but for grounding. The sea hadn't changed. The horizon still looked endless. She hated it for that. She loved it for that. That beach had taken everything from her and then inexplicably given something back. She let herself cry only once, long and quiet, and then never again. Because crying wouldn't bring him back. Wouldn't erase the fear or the fire or the weight of choices made in shadows, but it did make room for something else, something fragile and unfinished. That evening, as she stood on that same frozen beach, shoes sinking into salt-stained snow, something shifted in the distance. Not the wind, not the tide, a figure, a silhouette against the dying light, emerging from the edge of the woods that lined the coastline like old scars. He walked with a limp, slow but steady, a black coat, hands in his pockets, no bag, no rush, just presence. Claire didn't move. Didn't run. Her heart didn't lurch, didn't shatter. She simply stood there, letting the moment wrap itself around her like a tide that had always known its way home. She didn't need to see his face. She didn't even need him to speak. The fact that he was walking toward her was enough. The fact that he'd found the path back, despite everything, was enough. Sometimes the return matters more than the explanation. And sometimes silence says more than forgiveness ever could. She smiled, just once. Soft, steady, barely a flicker, a smile that held grief and grace and something quietly defiant, like a heartbeat that refused to quit, the kind of smile that doesn't ask for certainty. Only presence, only truth. And as the man in the black coat kept walking toward her, still distant, still wordless, she didn't lift her hand, didn't cry out, didn't call his name. She just waited. Because sometimes you don't need to be saved. Sometimes you only need someone to come back. If this story moved you even a little, we'd love to hear what it awakened in you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your words help keep this space alive and meaningful. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing to our channel. We put a lot of care and time into crafting stories like this. Your support truly helps us continue. Thank you for being here with us. We'll see you in the next one.